Hi, I'm Jill Colgrove, and I want to talk a little bit today with you about anxiety. Now, we all hear that word anxiety, but what does that really mean? So, sometimes anxiety really starts as just a form of worry. It's sometimes when we think of it on a spectrum, is we start with just kind of worrying about different things or kind of an extreme nervousness. And if we don't learn how to be able to find healthy ways to deal with our extreme worry or have a hard time managing that, it can lead to a progression of where we start feeling anxiety. Anxiety can continue to progress into what we call panic attacks. And so anxiety really it's a nervous disorder that's by a state of excessive uneasiness or apprehension. Sometimes, like I said, it's that extreme worry. It's a reaction sometimes that we feel to very stressful situations. And as I talked on that spectrum, we also see anxiety in things such as like obsessive compulsive disorder, or as I mentioned, panic attacks. And those tend to become down that progressive scale, again, if we're not managing those symptoms that we're feeling from that anxiety or from that worry. So the most important thing to remember is anxiety is very treatable and it's very manageable as we learn what those coping skills are and how to be able to manage those. So let's talk about some symptoms of anxiety. Sometimes those symptoms are things like as feelings of apprehension, feelings of dread, like I'm just dreading doing this. I'm very, very nervous about this. Sometimes anxiety might be where we're just having a lot of trouble concentrating. Sometimes we feel very tense or very jumpy. Sometimes anxiety is displayed where we are always anticipating the worst, always thinking in that negative state of the worst case scenario, the worst situation that could happen. Sometimes we see people that struggle with perfectionism, and perfectionism tends to create a lot of anxiety for folks as well. Anxiety is also displayed in ways where people become very irritable, very angry. And I want to point that out because sometimes anger is not always associated with anxiety. But anger and irritability can be a very telling symptom of somebody who is struggling. Another sign of anxiety would be somebody who's always kind of hypervigilant, who's watching out for signs of danger. Sometimes it's feeling like our mind has just gone blank and we just can't be able to have a thought or be able to put thoughts together. Sometimes anxiety is having irrational fears. Sometimes anxiety is having an intense fear of judgment, of what others might think or feel about us. But let's now talk a little bit about maybe physical symptoms of anxiety. Anxiety affects us physically. That often leads us to the doctor's office or to a hospital. Sometimes anxiety comes across as our heart is pounding and pounding. Sometimes it feels like it's beating out of our chest. Sometimes people feel like their chest is caving in on them. Sometimes they feel like they're having a hard time breathing. Sometimes folks will experience sweating that can be mild or that can be severe sweating. Sometimes it's hot and cold flashes. Sometimes we see anxiety in the form of our stomach being upset. This is the most common way to predict anxiety in children and kiddos and teenagers, is they have a lot of stomach problems. Sometimes anxiety has us feeling sick to our stomach or feeling very nauseous. Sometimes it has us shaking. Sometimes we have headaches, excessive fatigue and feeling very tired. Sometimes we might feel dizzy or have a dry mouth. And sometimes we feel chest pains. And so often anxiety can sometimes be mistaken as a heart attack because of those chest pains and the way that our heart is pounding and feeling. So how do we find ways to be able to cope with our anxiety? One of the big things I always encourage people to think about is, what are some of those thoughts that I'm having? If I can look at those thoughts and be able to write them down, and then how do I challenge that thought? So how do I find the opposite of what that thought is to help me be able to counteract some of those fears or that worry? Sometimes it's actually designating a worry time. So if we find ourselves excessively worrying about something, what we do is allow ourselves time. For example, 7 o'clock at night is going to be my worry time. So throughout the day, I tell myself I can't worry about this now, but I can worry about it at 7 o'clock. And so we designate that time and we give ourselves 30 minutes to worry all we want. That tends to help that worry diminish throughout the day. Sometimes for anxiety, it's engaging in relaxation. It's finding some meditation. It's doing some deep breathing. There's even apps that you can get on your phone that plays the relaxing music. There's an app that you can get that's called Mindfulness, and that really just helps us be able to engage in that relaxation. Another great skill for anxiety is to be able to get an adequate amount of sleep each night. And sometimes that's easier said than done, but if we want to try to find a way to be able to establish a sleep routine to get us in the habit of to allow ourselves that time to get an adequate amount of rest becomes really important. Exercise is another great skill for anxiety. Exercise doesn't mean we have to go start learning how to run or to enroll in the next 5K that might be offered in your community. Sometimes exercising is just getting out and going for a walk through the park, or maybe it's a walk around the block. Sometimes it's just going to the store and just taking a walk around through the store. Another way to manage anxiety is to make sure that we are eating healthy and make sure that we're eating regularly. Sometimes when we go too long in between meals, that can create low blood sugars, which makes us feel more anxious. And so making sure that we are eating somewhat regularly becomes vital. And along with eating healthy is also really being aware of your use of caffeine. Caffeine can be a stimulant which can increase our anxiety, and that caffeine is going to stimulate that and make our anxiety feel worse. If you know somebody or you yourself are really struggling with anxiety, it's very important to talk about that with someone that you trust. That can be a friend, that can be your pastor, that can also be a mental health professional. Is calling and setting an appointment to meet with them. Sometimes it's starting with your primary care doctor. You can also call. There's different numbers and hotlines that are available for you to call. And so I'm going to share some of those with you. And so, like the Boys Town National Hotline is a great number to be able to call when you're feeling extremely anxious. Being able to contact Crisis Response, which is a local number right here in our community that's answered by professionals 24 hours a day, 7 days a week when you're feeling extremely anxious, and they can be able to help walk you through that.